Good afternoon. Try that one more time. Good afternoon. Thank you. It's great to be with you here today. Boy, what a beautiful day in Palm Beach County. If you can't love Florida on a day like today, this is why we're the place that everybody wants to come to live, to take a vacation, to raise their families. It's a good reminder of what makes Florida so special. You know, I spoke to you a year ago, and a lot has changed in a year. Wendy was alluding to that. A lot has changed for me, a lot has changed for this country. And now I find myself in this very interesting position where I'm attending functions which are congratulating me on my upcoming retirement. I am the youngest United States Senator, and I'm about to retire at age 41. I will be the youngest, the Senate historian tells me, of 3 senators to retire in the last 100 years. So it's an interesting time for me. And one part of leaving the United States Senate is something has to be done and figured out with what will happen not only with your staff, which I've been working with to make sure that they will have a good transition into their next offices of public service, but also what will happen with my papers. When I came to the Senate, Senator Martinez was leaving. I was concerned about the papers of the constituents who had asked the office for help when they had problems with the federal government, trying to get a Social Security check or an immigration issue. We had thousands of case files Senator Martinez had that I was anxious to get a hold of because I didn't want anything to fall through the cracks. I didn't want someone to miss on a check that they needed or someone to be in peril on their immigration. And I found out at that time that all of the papers of a United States Senator are their personal possession. I come from state government background where every document is open to the public. In fact, when I was the governor's chief of staff, I would get email requests every week asking me for all of my emails. The St. Pete Times, the Miami Herald were very interested in what I was saying in my emails. And you had to give them over because that's the way it is in Florida. It's not the way it's in Washington. They are my personal possessions. Can you believe that? So one thing in my time here of winding down I had to decide is where would my papers go? And I have an announcement to make for you today. Over the last many years, I've come to admire an institution of higher learning right here in Palm Beach County. And under the leadership of President Lou Hardin and Vice President Bill Fleming, Palm Beach Atlantic has shown its dedication to not only education for the advancement of all things that we think about in education, getting a job, making money, but also moral and ethical teaching and bringing to the student an evaluation of their whole life. They have a Christian thematic to their education, which is important to my wife, Mikey, and me. So I am pleased and honored to tell you that today, Palm Beach Atlantic University has agreed to accept my personal papers and effects for the past 16 months. And I'd like to recognize President Hardin, Vice President Fleming, who are here, and thank them for taking these papers. I wanted to say a special thank you to a woman that was introduced to you earlier, and that's my wife, Mikey. This has been a challenging 16 months for her. When I found out that I would receive this appointment, I drove home to our house in Tallahassee, and she met me at the door, and she was crying, and it was not just because she was happy. She realized we were going to have to likely move our 3 sons, 6, 4, and 2 at the time, to Washington. And she also knew something that I knew and no one else knew, and that was that we were pregnant, and we were going to have another baby. Now, I've made this woman move twice when she's been pregnant, once to Tallahassee with our first son, and now this second time when we had our baby girl. We had our baby girl, Madeline, this past spring in Washington, D.C. So I am very appreciative to her, and I would ask that you recognize her because I couldn't have done these things without her. Thank you. So endings make you think about beginnings. And it wasn't that long ago that I was in this transition phase, having been selected to be your next senator. before I was sworn in. Now, Marco Rubio and others have a couple months here to make these decisions about who will be their staff and how things will work. I had a couple weeks. Vivian Mertitas is here. She's my deputy chief of staff. She was one of the people who decided to come and help me in Washington, leave her family and young kids to come support the work that we would do. But we only had a couple weeks to make these decisions. And during that process, I went to Washington and I met with the folks who actually run the Senate. Not the senators, but the people who are the staff folks to the Senate. If you've ever watched, when you were bored or had insomnia, the United States Senate on C-SPAN, you will notice that there's the dais and then there's two tables in front. And at those tables sit a couple folks. They are the secretaries and assistant secretaries to the majority and minority. And they are the ones who make the trains run on time to the extent the trains run on time in the Senate. And I met with them, as I did with other folks in Washington, Mitch McConnell, our Republican leader. And in this meeting with this gentleman who's the Republican secretary, we talked about some really just mechanical issues of how it works when you're a senator. And when the meeting finished, he said, "Would you like to go out on the Senate floor now and walk through some of these things?" And I wasn't prepared for this at that moment. I said, "Sure." And we walked down the hallway, and I could see through the doors the floor of the United States Senate. And the guards are there, and they open the doors, and I walked out on the floor, and there in front of me is that scene you've all seen. And there's the Vice President's chair. Under our system of government, the Vice President of the United States is the President of the Senate. He's not often there, but he's there on ceremonial occasions, and he can be there if we ever had a 50-50 vote. Constitutionally, he breaks the tie. So I'm there, and I look in, and I see his seat. And I walk down the aisle, and I look up, and around the chamber are the busts of the former presidents of the Senate, the former vice presidents of the United States, and right above the dais are Adams and Jefferson, our first two vice presidents. And I look around, and there's only 100 desks. These beautiful antique desks, all of them more than 100 years old. And behind those desks stood men like Dan Webster, Calhoun, Harry Truman, Jack Kennedy. The gentleman walked me over to the desk that I would stand behind. He said, "This is where you will advocate on behalf of Florida." And he showed me how the microphone works that you pull out and you put in your lapel. He said, "This is where you will stand to be recognized when you speak on behalf of your state." And in that moment, I felt it. I felt the responsibility. I felt the responsibility that I would represent 18.5 million people. It also occurred to me that Florida only gets 2 senators. Every state gets 2 senators, no matter their size. Remember that our founders framed the United States Senate for the little states, the small population states. It was the balance. The House is where the big states do well. It's proportional. Florida has 25 congressmen. We're going to get 2 more when the census is tabulated and we do the reapportionment after. But Florida only gets 2. Realize that there are states that's population we could fit in your county who get 2 senators: Hawaii, Rhode Island, Delaware, Montana, Wyoming. So not only did I realize I had to climb this learning curve very quickly, but that in a way we're outnumbered in Florida, and that I would have to work extra hard for you. Those of you who have been elected or appointed or judges, you've had this feeling when you were sworn in. So I went back to the office and said to Vivian and the rest of the folks that I work with, I want to get 6 years out of 16 months. And they rolled their eyes. They're not rolling their eyes now, because we've worked very hard. And we've tried to accomplish as much as we can, especially in light of the fact that Florida and America are struggling. This is a very difficult time for this country, and a very difficult time for Florida. Now, there are good things starting to happen in our economy, but let's face facts. This is the worst recession that we've been through in Florida since the Great Depression. If you are working, this is the worst recession that you've ever worked through, no matter what your age is. We've got 11.9% unemployment. Your unemployment in Palm Beach County is higher. It's nearly 10% in the country. It just went up 0.2 of a point in the last evaluation. We're in the top 3 in mortgage foreclosures in the country. I know you know that. This is part of ground zero here in Palm Beach County. We are #1 behind, according to Florida Trend, in mortgage payments for the first half of the year. And in the 3rd quarter of this year in Southeast Florida, mortgage foreclosures went up 25% over the 2nd quarter. So times are tough. If you're walking down the street and you see an able-bodied, working-age adult, 1 out of 5 of them are unemployed or underemployed. Underemployed meaning they're working a couple jobs now which are not paying them as much as the one job they used to have. At the same time, we are fighting 2 wars. We haven't fought 2 wars at the same time since World War II. Recovering from this financial meltdown, which is the worst since the Great Depression. Challenging times. And now we worry about things like North Korea, whose provocations in recent weeks are tantamount to an act of war. We worry about Iran gaining a nuclear weapon. We worry about Venezuela following Iran's playbook. A very challenging time. And in response, I think Congress has done some good things, and I've been proud to be a part of it. Some of them have not been things that all Republicans agreed on, but my goal is to represent you. I supported and was an author of a Small Business Lending Act. When I go around Florida, I talk to business people, especially small business people, and they tell me no matter what their business plan looks like, no matter what their prospects are, they can't get a loan. And if you can't get credit, you can't expand. And if you can't expand, you can't hire new people. It's one of the top 2 complaints I get from business people in this state. They can't get financing. So whether it's the cheese manufacturer that I met in Orlando who had to sell a majority of its business after it was refused by 10 banks to get a loan when it wanted to expand, or the small advertising business I've met in Jacksonville who wants to knock the wall down and hire 10 people but can't get a loan, Florida businesses need credit. So I worked with Senator Landrieu of Louisiana, and we fashioned a small business bill that will cut taxes for small businesses by $12 billion this year and provide $30 billion of financing to community banks. Not Goldman Sachs, but the banker down the street, so that small businesses can get loans and get people back to work. Because if they expand that building, they're going to need construction people, and they'll put those folks to work. And if they need to buy a piece of equipment, that equipment has to be made and manufactured. Those people will go to work. And they'll need lawyers and accountants and all the other things that businesses need. So I was proud of that work. The bankers tell me, who supported this bill, and so did the Chamber of Commerce, and so did Associated Industries, that $30 billion will turn into $300 in its ability to create jobs around this country, and I'm hopeful. I was able to work on an Export Promotion Act that's been signed into law by the President. You know, the size of government has grown staggeringly in the last 16 months. Since President Obama has become president, according to the Cato Institute, there are 270,000 new federal employees. 270,000 new federal employees. Each of them makes about $70,000 a year and has a full benefit package when the average private sector worker makes around $50,000, which is about the average in Palm Beach County. But one area that we've cut is export promotion. People in the Department of Commerce who will go out and tell small and medium-sized businesses how they can sell their goods overseas. If you can sell your product overseas when times are tough in a recession like this, you can gird yourself against a bad domestic economy. So when I met with a company in Tampa, Tampa Electric, Inc., who's been selling their goods overseas, they told me they have not laid off one person during this recession. In fact, we know that every dollar that's invested in exports has a $57 return to our economy. So I was proud of that work. I was also proud of a piece of legislation that the President signed that's going to fight Medicare fraud. Now, every politician tells you that when they go to Washington, they're going to cut out the waste, fraud, and abuse. But we never do. And South Florida is the capital of healthcare fraud in this country. Not a distinction we should want. In fact, when you look at the various fraud scams that are going on in healthcare, oftentimes the amount that's being charged for a particular healthcare area that's being scammed, like lately psychiatric care, the amount that's being reimbursed in Medicare for psychiatric care equals the rest of the country combined. It's not that people are getting psychiatric care more here than other places. It's that there are fraudsters who are setting up shops and strip shopping centers and office parks who are just running codes all day, and they're stealing your money to the tune of $60 to $100 billion a year. So we took a page from another industry that's about the same size as the healthcare business, that instead of having 1 out of every $7 be fraud, only has pennies on the $100 in fraud. And that's the credit card business. You all have had this experience. You've gone somewhere and used your credit card, usually when you traveled, and you got a phone call or an email from your credit card company saying, there's a fraud alert on your card. Did you really mean to make that transaction? You call them up and you say, yes, I did buy that television at Best Buy in Washington, D.C., which is what happened to me when I got the fraud alert. Now, why did they have that fraud alert? Was there somebody watching the computer screen? No, it's a computer program. It's analytics. They look at my charging habits. I'm out of state. At the time, my home address is Tallahassee. I'm buying a piece of equipment that's oftentimes purchased when there's a fraudulent act, a television. And they stop the fraud before it starts. If I don't say okay, they don't pay Best Buy. Imagine if we could take common sense like that and use it in Medicare. So now, under a law that we passed, that the President signed, a program will be set up where we will have private companies come in and make a bid to see if they can take that same kind of analytics and apply it to healthcare. So when the guy sells the same wheelchair 100 times in an hour, maybe we won't reimburse him first without checking. And an independent group in Washington has said that that will save us as much as $20 billion a year. So there are some good things we've done, some things I've been proud to be part of. But I want to tell you that the majority of things that happen in Washington are hurting this economy and creating too much uncertainty. Now, I told you that small businesses can't get loans. The other thing that businesses tell me around the state, small, medium, and large alike, is that there's so much uncertainty happening with all of the things that are being passed in Washington that they don't feel like they can hire. They don't know what the playing field is. And if they don't know what the playing field is, it creates an uncertainty in them so not to hire that next employee. Let me give you an example. The health care bill. Last year, at this time, I was in Washington. We were in session 23 straight days in a row in the United States Senate. The last time the United States Senate had been in continuous session for 23 straight days, weekends and all, was when the Senate determined whether or not this country would go to war in World War I. And that bill, well-intentioned as it may be, cuts $500 billion out of Medicare, a program that's already in financial trouble, raises taxes on healthcare companies, drug device companies, medical device companies, which is going to increase the cost of healthcare, and does nothing to lower the cost of healthcare for all Americans. You remember that promise. We'll lower the cost of healthcare for most Americans, or all Americans, and if you like your health insurance program, you can keep it. Both have proven not to be true. And the mandate that will come when you hire that next employee and the uncertainty of how this 2,000-page bill will be implemented is causing business people to pull back and not hire that next employee. The financial regulatory reform bill is the same. A company in Florida, in fact, a company here in Palm Beach County, told me that if that law passed, and it did, that they will consider moving a section of their work overseas to the Bahamas so that it will not fall under these new regulations. Washington is not responding to job creation. There are other politics, there are other priorities. The worst of all is one we're still dealing with. And much to my wife's chagrin, I had to fly back to Washington on Saturday to vote on these two show proposals on the tax issue. What business people around this state tell me is, how can I plan for next year when I don't know what my taxes are going to be? I don't know how much I'm going to pay in taxes, how can I hire that new employee? So here we are like high school kids who've not done their term paper that's due tomorrow, waiting until the last minute to get this done. By the way, we don't have an estate tax this year. It's 0%. So my friendly advice to you is if your children ask you to go hunting between now and the end of the year, just say no. Another piece of work that should have been done. Now we're going to get to a solution on this tax piece, I believe. We are going to extend the tax cuts for all Americans for a couple years. And I believe also that we will do something about the estate tax, at least I hope we will, and we will also do something to extend unemployment compensation for people who are struggling, something that I believe we should do. I think we should pay for it, but it's something that I believe we should do. So there are some big issues left before the end of the year, issues that are important to you and important to our families. But I want to conclude my remarks today on something that I talked to you about last time I spoke to you, but has become all the more clear to me what a pressing issue this is for our republic. People will often ask me, what's the most surprising thing about being a member of the United States Senate? And the most surprising thing to me is the way this government misspends your money. It is shocking. My experience is in state government, where we have a constitutional requirement to balance the budget. My experience is in the private sector. I helped to lead the Gunster firm. My colleague Bill Perry's here, the managing partner. He will remember a conversation I had with him where I was concerned about the price of those individual coffees in the coffee room. They seemed way too fancy in a recession. He vetoed that, and the people at Gunster are still happy. But that's what business people do, right? They look at every cost and see whether or not this is justified. What Congress does, their budgeting, is to take last year's budget and add to it. Now, my wife, Mikey, and I have small kids. We're in the process of our kids telling us what they want on their Christmas list, which is a growing and growing and growing. What Washington does, it would be like you had an adult child or a older teenage child, and they gave you their Christmas list, and you not only gave them what was on their Christmas list this year, but you gave them what was on their Christmas list for every year going back to when they were 3. We are funding the priorities of the 60s, 70s, and 80s without any account as to whether or not they're still the priorities of this country. Still not whether they're efficient or effective if they are the priorities. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine is Senator from Nebraska, used to be the Secretary of Agriculture under the Bush administration. He tried to close farm offices in places where there were no longer farms. Congress stopped him. And the reason why it continues every year, is that there's no requirement to balance the budget. I have filed a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. I have sought to impose spending caps. Until Congress caps its spending, there will be no accountability. There will be no prioritization. If you don't have to make tough choices, you don't. I propose we go back to 2007 level spending. 4 or 5 of my colleagues signed on to this proposal. 2007. Was our spending in 2007 on the federal government so austere that we couldn't live with what it was then? Most Floridians made more in 2007 than they're making today. If we would roll back our spending at 2007 levels and cap spending across the board, we would balance the federal budget in 13. And we would cut the national debt that's currently almost $14 trillion in half. And we would save America. Now, why do I say save America? Last year, your government spent $1.3 trillion more than it took in. $1.3 trillion. It took this country 200 years to go $1 trillion in debt. And we just went $1.3 trillion in 1 year. I've been in the United States Congress for 15 months. In 15 months, we've gone $2 trillion in debt. It is now close to $14 trillion. Why does that matter to you? Haven't we had a debt for a long time? We have, but it's cascading out of control. And right now, we are spending almost $200 billion a year paying the debt service on the things we couldn't afford in the past. We are like that family who spent too much money on their credit card who now can't make more than the minimum balance. And every month, it grows and grows and grows. And what happens at one point? At one point, you can't pay your bills. So by the end of the decade, the proposed and forecasted national debt, this is just 9 years from now, is $26 trillion, up from 14. When it's $26 trillion, the interest payment is $900 billion. And the government will fail. And long before that happens, what's happening now in Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain will happen here, which is that the financial markets will anticipate this failure. When I came to Congress, I gave my maiden address, and in that speech, I talked about the debt, and I said, I don't want to live in a world where my children will come to me someday and say, Dad, we've decided that we can get a better opportunity in another country. But that prediction was too optimistic, because it's not going to wait for my kids to grow up. It's not our children's problem now. Now it's our problem. So the Deficit and Debt Commission recently came together and filed their report. And these are serious, sober people. And they want to cut $4 trillion from our budget and debt. And that's a big number. But realize that'll just take us to $22 trillion by the end of the decade, not 26. It's not enough. And when they released their report, there was the gnashing of teeth and screaming by both Democrats and Republicans alike. But I am hopeful, because a liberal Democrat that serves with me, Dick Durbin from Illinois, and two conservative Republicans, Mike Crapo and Tom Coburn, voted for that report. And they voted for that report even though there was a lot of stuff in there they didn't like, both sides. And they're going to get beat up at home by both sides for voting for it. But it was courageous. It was the right thing to do. It's the kind of leadership we need in Washington. And if we could have that kind of leadership, we could save America. I mean, I think we need to realize that what has created our prosperity is not our government. What's created our prosperity in this country is the free market system of capitalism. And in that system of cut and thrust and back and forth, there are some that win and there are some that lose. But what happens in that system is it creates new companies, new jobs, new opportunities, and new wealth. And through this dynamic process, any American can succeed. And it allows us to remember that unique expression, only in America. And hopefully that will be an anthem for our future and not just a refrain from our past. I believe that we as Americans can do anything. I recently had the opportunity to have dinner with Doris Kearns Goodwin. She's the Pulitzer Prize-winning author who wrote Team of Rivals. She's writing a book about FDR right now. And she reminded me this. When we were attacked by Japan, December 7th, 1941, and entered the war against Japan and Germany shortly thereafter, we were 10 years behind the German war effort. Nazi Germany, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, had spent all of the 30s building up their military might, while we were suffering through the Great Depression. So by the time the war started, and this is just one of many examples, it was taking America on average 300 days to build a troop transport. By the time the war was over, just 5 years later, we were building a troop transport every single day. There is nothing we as Americans cannot do. We beat Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany at the same time. We put a man on the moon. We have mapped the human genome. And in our spare bedrooms and garages and even dorm rooms, Americans have created the inventions and the companies that have changed the world and created jobs for millions of people. We are that shining city on the hill. We are that beacon of freedom. We are that last best hope for mankind upon which God has shed his grace. I believe that we can overcome these challenges, but only if we have the will to send to Washington people with the courage of their convictions, who will do what's right, maybe not what's popular, serve their country, and then come home. President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, said that one of the greatest privileges that life has to offer is the opportunity to do work that is worth doing. For the past 16 months, I've had the chance, the blessing, the privilege to do work that is worth doing. I've had the chance to do it for you and for the people of this great state that I love. It's been the privilege of my life, but now that privilege is coming to an end. Thank you so much for listening to me today. God bless you, and God bless our great country.